Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskrityam Varam Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Tiriyet Nashtaprayeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Naistike. So continuing with the discussion of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by Satsuru Das Goswami, Volume 2, Planting the Seed, New York City, 1965 to 1966. So Prabhupada in his loft with David and Bowery, and David, just because of the drugs use, he was yelling, howling, running all around in the loft. And then he went to where Prabhupada was sitting, and Prabhupada found him face to face with David. David had nothing to say. There was no particular disagreement, just madness. Prabhupada moved quickly down the 4 flights of stairs. He had not stopped to gather up any of his belongings or even to decide where he would go or whether he would return. There had been no time to consider anything. He had taken quite a shock, and now he was leaving the arena of David's madness. The usual group of bums was sitting in the doorway, and with their customary flourish of courtesy, they allowed him to pass. They were used to the elderly swamis coming in and out, going shopping and returning. And, going shopping and returning. And they didn't bother him. But he was not going shopping today. Where was he going? He didn't know. He had come onto the street without knowing where to go, where he would go. Can we imagine? We cannot even imagine. 70-year-old Prabhupada running around like this in the middle of Bowery, nowhere to go. He wasn't going back to the loft, that was for sure. But where would he go? The pigeons flew from roof to roof. Traffic rumbled by, and the ever-present bumps loitered around, getting drunker on cheap, poisonous alcohol. Although Prabhupada's home had suddenly become an insane terror, the street at its door was also a hellish, dangerous place. He was shaken. He could call Dr. Mishra's and they might take him in, but that chapter of his life was over. And he had gone on to something better. He had his own classes, young people chanting and hearing. Was it all over now? After 9 months in America, he had finally gotten a good response to his preaching and kirtan. He couldn't just quit now. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, whom everyone knew and respected in Vrindavan as a distinguished scholar and devotee, who had an open invitation to see the Vice President of India and many other notables, now had to face starkly that he had not one friend of stature in the United States. Suddenly he was as homeless as any derelict on the street. In fact, many of them with their long-time berths in flop houses were more secure than he. They were ruined but settled. The Bowery could be a chaotic hell if you weren't on a very purposeful errand going directly to the store or back to your place. It was no place to stand wondering, where will you live, or is there a friend you can turn to? He wasn't on his way to Chinatown to shop, nor was he taking a little stroll, soon to return to the shelter of the loft. If he couldn't go to the loft, he had no place. So how difficult it was becoming to preach in America amid these crazy people. He had written prophetically in this poem the day he had arrived in Boston Harbor. My dear Lord, I do not know why you have brought me here. Now you can do with me whatever you like. But I guess you have some business here, otherwise why would you bring me to this terrible place? What about his scheduled classes? What about David? Should he go back and try to talk with the boy? This had been David's first fit of violence, but there had been other tense moments. Like David had a habit of leaving the slope on the floor of the shower stall, and Prabhupada had asked him not to. because it was a hazard. But David wouldn't listen. Prabhupada had continued to remind him. And one day David had gotten angry and shouted at him. But there was no real enmity. Even today's incident had not been a matter of personal differences. The boy was a victim. But Prabhupada just couldn't go back. Who knows what he would do? Prabhupada walked quickly. He had free passage on the Scindia line. He could go home to Vrindavan. But his spiritual master had ordered him to come here by the strong desire of Sri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He had written while crossing the Atlantic. The holy name of Lord Gauranga will spread throughout all the countries of the Western world. Before nightfall, he would have to find some place to stay, a way to keep up the momentum of his preaching. This is what it meant to be working without government sponsorship, without the support of any religious organization, without a patron. It meant being vulnerable and insecure. Prabhupada faced a crisis as a test from Krishna. The instruction of Bhagavad Gita was to depend on Krishna for protection. In all activities, just depend upon me and work always under my protection. In such devotional service, be fully conscious of me. You will pass over all the obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. He decided to phone Carl Jurgens and asked him to help. Hearing the Swami's voice on the phone, it was an emergency. Carl at once agreed that Prabhupada could move in with him and his wife Eva. Their place was close by on Center Street, 5 blocks west of Bowery near Chinatown. Carl could be right over. After Carl found Prabhupada, they went straight to Carl's place, an AIR loft, smaller than the one Prabhupada had been living in. It had a main living area, large and open, with areas for the kitchen and bedroom partitioned off. There were decorative indoor plants and a profusion of throw pillows placed all around. Carl's loft was much brighter than the dingy factory-like space in the loft on the Bowery. The floor was painted bright orange. Carl used to say it looked like the deck of a ship. The walls and ceilings were white, and light from 7 skylights filled the room. Carl and Eva settled the Swami in one corner. Prabhupada had left his belongings at David's loft and didn't want to go back. So Carl went over to pick up a few essential items. Prabhupada asked him to leave most of his things, including his books, suitcases, and reel-to-reel tape recorder, where they were. Although by this time David had come down from the intense effects of the LSD, he remained crazy. When Carl arrived at the loft, the door was locked and David was inside, afraid to let anyone in, although finally he relented. He had shut and locked all the windows, making the loft oppressively hot and stuffy. Bill Epstein, who also came by that day, analyzed David as having had a drug-induced nervous breakdown, a narcopsychosis. So they knew all these technical terms, but still they won't stop taking drugs. And although David was sorry he had exploded at the Swami, neither Bill nor Carl thought Prabhupada should live with David again. Evidently, Prabhupada's chances of making the loft into a Radha Krishna temple were finished. Carl and Bill gathered up a few of the Swami's belongings and David stayed behind in the loft. He wanted to be alone. Carl Jurgens knew Prabhupada's living habits and wanted to accommodate him with a suitable place to live and work. In a small alcove at one end of his loft, Carl had a small study which he allocated for the Swami. Carl also set up a cushioned dais and arranged the living room around it so that guests could sit on the floor in a semicircle. Carl's wife, who didn't really like the idea of the Swami moving in, agreed to cover a few cushions with Indian Madras material for him anyway. Things went smoothly for a while. Prabhupada continued his morning and evening classes, and many of the Bowery hip crowd came by. 3 of his regular callers lived right in the same building, and few others, including Carl's brother, were just around the block. Michael Grant, James Green, even David Allen came. Don Nathanson, an artist. I was at Carl's loft and the Swami comes strolling in one day. So I already knew he was on the scene from David's. Mostly musicians were coming. They were enjoying the private morning session with him. And that is really strange in itself because these people were up almost all night and he used to do it at 6 in the morning for 1 hour. He would lead them in chanting with his hand symbols, dot, dot, da, dot, dot, da. It was strange because that crowd was heavy into drugs and they were well read. But for a short period, they used to go every morning, 9 or 10 of them, and they felt very good about it. They felt very good that they did that in the morning. Carl felt that the creative group who came to see the Swami in his studio were all quick to enter into the mood of the kirtan, but they were using it in their own ways to supplement their own private visions and ecstasies, with no real intention of adopting the disciplines or the undivided worship of Lord Krishna. Prabhupada was their first real contact with a spiritual person, and yet, even without trying to understand, they became absorbed in his kirtans and in what he had to say. Carl would invite them, hey, come on, this is genuine. This is real, you'll like it. It is music, it's dance, it's celebration. Carl saw that people just felt good being in the Swami's presence and meditating on the chanting and eating the Swami's cooking. It was unlike anything they had experienced before, except maybe for the moments of creative insight. Yet for Carl and Eva, Prabhupada's simple presence created difficulty. Never before during his whole stay in America had he been a more inconvenient or unwanted guest. Carl's studio was arranged for him and his wife to live in alone, using the bedroom, kitchen, and living room any way they liked. If they wanted to smoke marijuana or eat meat or whatever, that was their prerogative. This was Carl's home. He lived there with his wife Eva and their dogs and cats. But now they had to share it with the Swami. But still, I mean, they decided to let Prabhupada come in with them. Move in. Almost at once, the situation became intolerable for Eva. She resented the Swami's presence in her home. She was a feminist, a liberated white woman with a black husband and a good job. She didn't like the Swami's view on women. She hadn't read his books or attended his classes, but she had heard that he was opposed to sexual intercourse except for conceiving children. And that, in his view, a woman was supposed to be shy and chaste and help her husband in spiritual life. She knew that the Swami's 4 rules means no meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, or gambling. And she definitely did not want Carl's Swami trying to change their ways to suit his. And he had better not expect her to wait on him as a servant. She sensed the Swami objecting to almost everything she did. If she were to seek his advice, he would probably ask her to stop taking drugs, get rid of the cats and dogs, stop drinking, and stop contraceptive sex. If the Swami had his way, they would probably eat only at certain times and only certain foods. Eva was a heavy smoker, so he probably wouldn't like being around her. She was ready for a confrontation. Boy. But Prabhupada was not one to make intolerant demands while living in another's home. He kept to his allotted corner of the loft, and he made no demands or criticisms. Hadn't he seen his host and butler eating meat and only remarked, think nothing of it? Nevertheless, his imposing spiritual presence made Eva sorry Carl had ever met him. To Eva, the Swami was an inimical force, and she, being candid and independent, let him know. As soon as he asked whether she could bring him something, she replied, get it yourself. And still, Prabhupada, how much he tolerated. Amazing. Carol Baker saw the situation as being extremely uncomfortable and tense. Eva was quite resentful. Eva complained to Carol. Here she was paying rent for the loft, working hard, and this man was trying to change their way of life. Carol. Eva couldn't handle his teachings, and she couldn't handle his influence over Carl. She didn't feel so constrained, but she felt that Swamiji was making Karl feel constrained. This was Eva's main objection. The Swami was influencing Karl. Her relationship with Karl had only recently begun, and Karl was aware that she needed much of his time. He agreed with his wife, yet he couldn't refuse the Swami. He was interested in Indian music, poetry, and religions, and he was a living authority, vastly knowledgeable in all facets of Indian culture. Right in his home, Prabhupada would cook his meals in their kitchen, and right away Karl would be there, eager to learn the art of Indian cuisine. Karl also wanted the Swami to show him how to play the drum. They would have long talks together. Carol. Karl was trying to be something he really wasn't, but he would never have suggested that the Swami had to be. Swami, I'm sure, was astute enough to pick up on this tension. As soon as he could, he tried to move to another place. Gradually, Karl reached an impasse in his relationship with Prabhupada. He couldn't share his life with both his wife and the Swami, and ultimately he was more inclined towards his wife. Karl. I couldn't see my loft becoming a temple. I was raising cats and dogs, and he wanted them removed. He used to call me a meat eater, but then he changed our diet. Of course, he was hitting the American culture, which doesn't know what all this business is. I had to put it on myself as much as anyone. I could understand and absorb India through an impersonal agency like a book or a record. But here was a living representative of Godhead, and to me it was as difficult as anything I've ever had to do before or since. Prabhupada was not insensitive to the distress his presence was causing. He didn't want to inconvenience anyone, and of course he could have avoided all inconvenience, both for himself and for people like Eva, if he had never come to America. But he wasn't concerned with convenience or inconvenience, pleasing Eva or displeasing her. He wanted to teach Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had a mission, and Karl's loft didn't seem to be the right base for it. Prabhupada's friends all agreed he should move more into the center of things. The Bowery and Chinatown were too far out of the way. They would find him a new place. Forced by conditions, he accepted as Krishna's mercy. Prabhupada sat patiently, trying not to disturb anyone. Yet something about Krishna consciousness, day and night, yet speaking about Krishna. Karl assured him that with half a dozen people searching, it wouldn't take long to find a new place. And they would all chip in together and help him with the rent. A week passed and no one had found a suitable place for the Swami. One day Prabhupada suggested that he and Karl take a walk up to Michael Grant's place and ask him to help. Mike. I was awakened one morning very early and Karl was on the phone saying Swamiji and I were just taking a walk, and we thought we would come up and see. I said, but it's too early in the morning. And he said, well, Swamiji wants to see you. They were very nearby, just down the street, so I had to quickly get dressed. And by the time I got to the door, they were there. I was totally unprepared, but invited them up. The television had been on from the previous night, and there were some cartoons on. Swami sat between Karl and me on the couch. I was keeping a pet cat, and the cat jumped on Swami's lap, and he abruptly knocked it off on the floor. We began to talk, but Swamiji glanced over at the cartoons on the television set and said, this is nonsense. Suddenly, I realized that the television was on and that it was nonsense. I got up very quickly, saying, why? Yes, it is nonsense, and turned it off. As Prabhupada talked, he tried to impress on Mike how difficult it was for him to live with Karl and Eva. And Mike listened. But was the Swami so sure he couldn't go back to Bowery Loft and live with David Allen? Except for that one incident. It had been a nice setup, hadn't it? Prabhupada explained that David had become a madman from too much LSD. He was dangerous. Mike gave the Swami a half incredulous look. David Allen? Dangerous? Prabhupada then told the story. There is one old saying in India that you get yourself a spiritual master You sit opposite him. You learn everything from him that you can. Then you kill him. You move his body to one side and then you sit in his place and you become the guru. As Prabhupada spoke, Mike began to feel that David was dangerous, so he didn't ask for any more details. Mike could see that Swamiji was appealing to him for help, and as they all sat together on the couch, Mike and Carl quickly nodded in agreement. The Swami was looking at Mike, and Mike was trying to think. So how can we help Swamiji? Carl interjected. Mike explained that he was a pianist and he had to practice every day. He had two pianos, two sets of drums, a vibraphone, and other instruments right there in his apartment. Musicians were always coming over to practice, and they all played the instruments for hours. Also, he was living with a girl, and there was a cat in the apartment. But Mike promised that he would help find the Swami a new place. Prabhupada thanked him, and along with Karl, stood to leave. Mike felt obligated. He was good at getting things done, and he wanted to do this for Swami. So the next day he went to the Village Voice, got the first newspaper off the press, looked through the classified ads until he found a suitable prospect and phoned the landlord. It was a storefront on 2nd Avenue, and an agent, Mr. Gardinger, agreed to meet Mike there. Carl and Swami also agreed to come. So storefront means a shop on 2nd Avenue. Mr. Gardinger and Mike were the first to arrive. Mike noted the unusual hand-painted sign, "Matchless Gifts," above the front window. It was a holdover. Mr. Gardiner explained. From when the place had been a nostalgic gift shop, Mike proceeded to describe the Swami as a spiritual leader from India, an important author and a Sanskrit scholar. The rental agent seemed receptive. As soon as Prabhupada and Karl arrived and everyone had been congenially introduced, Mr. Gardiner showed them the small storefront. Prabhupada, Karl, and Mike carefully considered responsibilities. It was empty, plain, and dark. The electricity had not been turned on, and it needed repainting. It would be good for meetings, but not for Swami's residence. But $125 a month, it seemed promising. Then Mr. Gardiner revealed a small second-floor apartment just across the rear courtyard, directly behind the storefront. Another $71 a month, and the Swami could live there, although first Mr. Gardiner would have to repaint it. The total rent would come to $196, and Carl, Mike, the others would pitch in. So actually that is where that was first Prabhupada's place on his own, and that is where ISKCON was started, 26 2nd Avenue. Prabhupada had the idea of making Mr. Gardiner the first official trustee of his fledgling Krishna Consciousness Society. During the conversation, he presented Mr. Gardiner with a 3-volume set of his Srimad Bhagavatam, and inside the front cover, he wrote a personal dedication and then signed it A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Mr. Gardiner felt flattered and honored to receive these books from the author himself. He agreed to become a trustee of the new Society for Krishna Consciousness and so pay the society $20 a month. Then, good bargain. Mr. Gardiner took a week to paint the apartment. Meanwhile, Mike arranged for the electricity and water to be turned on and had a phone installed, and he and Carl raised the first month's rent among their friends. When everything was ready, Mike gave Prabhupada a call at Carl's. See, so much of struggle. And this is just the beginning of struggles. So much struggle he had to go through more. Anyway, we'll stop here. See anybody has any questions or comments? Okay, you all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jai Shri Ram.